All right, guys, and welcome to section 3 of your chapter 9 on theft, really, and lying. Today, the focus is going to be on theft. We're really looking at the 7th and 10th commandments, and we'll dive headlong into the 8th commandments on Monday and Tuesday. Two quick things that I want to kind of dive into to just draw some connections. When we talked about the 6th and 9th commandments, I forgot to kind of draw this connection to the 7th and 10th, right? The 6th commandment, like the 7th commandment, deals with our outward actions and prohibitions of bad outward actions, bad things that we do. So the 6th case, it would be violations of chastity and the sacrament of marriage. The 7th commandment would be violations of other people's stuff, right? The reality that other people have things. The 9th commandment talks about inward dispositions, inward feelings, thoughts, etc., about those things that lead us to those outward actions. So to the 10th commandment talks about those outward actions, but really about the inward causes of them and how we need to eliminate those things. So covetousness is what we talked about with the 9th commandment, right? Lust, right? Well, covetousness is part of the 10th commandment too. 7th commandment, you shall not steal. The 10th commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's property, right? Or paraphrasing it. Which also coveting, right? Lusting, lust of the eyes is what it's sometimes referred to. So there's that connection between the previous chapter and this one. Something I didn't talk about. I mean, gave you this huge kind of understanding, hopefully, of social justice in the last two videos. I just want to kind of break something down for you, right? When we think about justice, we know that the definition is kind of speaks to relationship, right? It speaks to giving what is due or what is owed to other. Social justice is one of 4 different types of relationships that justice applies to. Each of them has their own kind of name, and I want you to be aware of them because they speak of different types of relationships. Okay. When we talk about these different relationships, we're talking about person-to-person relationships. We're talking about the relationship between ourselves and governments, and between governments or authorities and ourselves. And then the one that we talked about, the last one, social justice or contributive justice. What can we contribute to the good of society? So just really reaching down here for some notes to help me give you these in a way that's going to make sense. We'll start with the individual to individual or person to person. And when I say person to person or individual to individual, it can mean more than one person to more than one person. But generally, we think about individual to individual. And that's known as commutative relationships. Commutative, Commutative. And it speaks to how we are commutative, that is, how we communicate, how we interact with others, right? And that, I think, is what most of us think of when we think of justice, because we think about those individual actions we take toward or against others, or what they take toward or against us. But that is part, not the entirety of justice. So commutative justice, we also have justice at play in terms of a relationship between us and greater levels of authority or society as a whole. So the first one is distributive justice, and we talked about this in terms of the universal destination of goods and things like that. It talks about the responsibility that those higher levels of authority of society have towards us as individuals, the reality that they have an obligation to make sure that people have access to those goods for all creation, the universal destination of goods, that our rights are being protected, right? Those rights that we all have and possess. And that, too, is part and parcel of justice. So if between individuals is commutative, from those higher levels to lower levels, from those authorities to individuals is distributive. And it makes sense. They're distributing, making sure that everyone has access to rights, goods, etc. The reverse is true. What do we as individuals owe to governmental authorities and society as a whole? And we call that legal justice, right? And how do we do that? By obeying laws, by being good citizens, by voting, all that stuff that is good and legal in terms of our lives, right? So we have commutative, individual to individual. We have distributive, which is what governments distribute down to us as individuals, or what they should be doing. And then the reverse of that, if you will, is legal justice, what we as individuals should be doing towards society as a whole and to our legal authorities. And then social justice, which is sometimes referred to as contributive justice. I blanked for a second. Contributive justice. What can we contribute to the good, the common good, right? How can we help those? And really, it's the application of Christ's teaching in the world that we live in to the different levels of society. In many ways, it's the how can we fill in the gaps that happen in that distributive justice, where the governmental authorities fall short of their job in terms of making available to the individual what is necessary for reaching the common good. So I wanted to kind of point that out because it's helpful for us when it comes to understanding justice, okay? So now getting to the point, 7 minutes into the video, theft, covetousness, and restitution. There are 3 questions we're going to answer today. We're going to go through a couple of things here. Not a ton that we're going to go over. I'm going to be relatively quick. First question, what are the sins against the goods of others? And these are really, when we talk about sins against the goods of others, these are the root causes. These are the things that exhibit covetousness, right? Which lead us to doing things we shouldn't do. What is the obligation of restitution? And what is spiritual poverty? And you would hear something like spiritual poverty and think it's a bad thing, when in fact it is a good thing. It's a good thing. So 7th and 10th commandment, I already gave you kind of definitions. Theft. Let's just kind of go into what are examples of theft, what are examples of violations of the 7th commandment. Some of them are pretty obvious. Some of them might be less so. One that might not seem so obvious, vandalism, right? How's vandalism theft? Well, you are destroying someone else's property. It might not be belong to an individual, but you are damaging something that is not yours. You are within your rights in certain situations to destroy your own property, but even then it can be sinful to do so, depending on any number of factors. But you can, in certain situations, have the right. In fact, sometimes you have the responsibility to destroy things that you possess, that you own, depending on what they do. But generally speaking, if you are damaging, destroying somebody else's stuff, that is going to be a violation of the 7th commandment. Cheating, right? Taking someone else's ideas, someone else's work, and passing it off as your own, right? Again, trying to show that you possess something that you don't is sin against the 7th commandment. It is also, spoilers, a violation of the 8th commandment. And lying. Violations, any type of business type of fraud, like reporting more payroll hours than you actually worked, wasting time at work, price gouging, shoplifting, all those things are violations of the 5th commandment. Failure to pay taxes and bills, overspending someone else's money, like going to a restaurant for your job and, taking a client out to dinner for $50 and then telling your work that it cost you $200. All those things are violations and pretty obvious. At its core, when we talk about violations of the 7th commandment, they almost all revolve around theft in some way, shape, or form. which of course is the unjust taking of someone else's possession against their reasonable will. Now, the question that I asked you guys the other day, in terms of if you're in the middle of the forest somewhere and you have been without food, water for days, and food for days and water for 24 hours or so, and are really on the brink of some potential problems, like you are in dire straits, and you come across a cabin and it's locked. Do you have can you break into it without violating the seventh commandment? And the answer is actually yes, but there are some caveats to it, right? You could, and this is, let me just be frank and say, generally speaking, we do a lot of mental gymnastics to kind of con ourselves into saying behaviors are good. But in this case, you can rationalize, and rationalization is not always a good thing, but in this case, you can rationalize that if a person were in this place and saw the position that you were in, it's reasonable to assume that they would help you, okay? Now, having said that, if you were to break into the cabin, if you were to go in and take stuff that does not belong to you, you do owe it to the person to restore what you've taken from them. If you damage the door, damage the building to get into it, you would need to fix that and pay that back. Any of the goods that you've taken, you would need to pay that back. That is what we call restitution, which is the second question, right? When we get to lies, if stealing causes damage, right, it's pretty obvious to see the type of damage, like, okay, I took X amount of dollars, I owe them X amount of dollars, right? So to restore what we've taken from them in terms of justice, giving what we owe them restitution when it comes to theft. Another R word when we get to when we get to the eighth commandment, lying, our lies do damage, right? Our lies do damage to other people. So we also, out of justice, owe making good to the harm that our lies do. That R word is reparation, right? We need to repair the damage that our lie causes. So every time we talk about these things in terms of the seventh, eighth commandments, we do owe, every time we fall short, some type of, out of justice, make good, repair work, if you will. Okay? So in the case of theft, it's restitution. Okay? One of the kind of less known forms of theft is excessive gambling. Now, I'm not going to tell you that gambling or games of chance in and of themselves are bad, but when they lead to the point where someone who is supposed to be taking care of themselves and or others is no longer able to because of the gambling that they're doing, that's where it becomes sinful. So gambling, let me be clear, is in and of itself not inherently evil and can be a legitimate form of entertainment when legal to do so, when appropriate to do so. But if it gets in the way of you being able to support yourself or support others, then it is sinful. Robbery is obviously a type of theft. It's slightly different than theft in some way, shape, or form. It is taking the property of another through force, through violence. And it is a violation, obviously, of the seventh commandment, but could and often does involve perhaps even violations of the fifth commandment as far as violence. So if you look in your textbooks on page 248, that question that I did ask you the other week about, and which I just kind of went into, does answer itself. Those because everyone has a right to life, which involves nourishment, clothing, medicine, and shelter. They have the right to avail themselves of material goods. In the case of extreme necessity, an individual may take some private possessions from another if it is required to preserve life for himself or herself and his or her family. And then the caveat continues on the next page, 249. The Catechism of the Catholic Church assures the faithful that when in dire circumstances, people have a right to a part of their neighbor's possessions. There is not theft if consent can be presumed or if refusal is contrary to reason and the universal destination of goods. This is the case of obvious and urgent necessity, when the only way to provide for immediate essential needs, food, shelter, clothing, is to put at one's disposal and use the property of others. But again, you do owe restitution. You need to make good for any kind of damage that you've done. Okay. So sins against the goods of others, which you find on page 249, really talks about covetousness, the root of the violations of the 7th and 10th commandments. They are, and I'm going to try and go in alphabetical order. I can't make any guarantees that I will, because I sometimes brain fart. Avarice, envy, and greed. We often use these words interchangeably, but we really shouldn't. They do speak to different motivations, different types of desire or disordered desire. Okay, so avarice. Avarice is an inordinate desire for wealth, right? Sometimes it's because of the power that goes with wealth, but it's always about that wealth, right? Inordinate desire for acquiring and hoarding money or wealth. So an example of that would be Nike moves their factory from Oregon to Bangladesh because they're able to pay 12 cents on the dollar for labor. They don't have to pay benefits, etc. Basically, so they can hoard all of the profits into their own pockets. Do they need it? No, right? But as a for-profit organization who does not kind of necessarily buy into the reality that we're called to work toward the common good, they're looking at how can I make the most amount of profit. It's disordered, right? And these are all disordered, all three, avarice, envy, and greed, because all of them put things other than God first, right? In the case of avarice, it's money, right? In the case of envy, it's your particular desire for someone else's possessions or talents, right? And your unhappiness at their good fortune. You desire what they have, whether it's stuff or ability, so much that it becomes a block to you and what is most important, relationship with God. Okay, so envy, wrongful desire for someone else's possessions or talents, and you really are unhappy, sometimes even angry at their good fortune. Perfect example, the story of Cain and Abel, right? Cain is envious of Abel and the pleasure that God gets from Abel's sacrifice. And well, you see what that leads to, right? Not just kind of envy, but ultimately to murder. And so envy often, as we're going to see, covetous often does, leads to other sins. And so that's a good example of that one. The last one, greed. And I think most of us kind of know what greed is. But greed is an excessive desire for unneeded or unnecessary goods, right? You already have stuff. You just want more, right? It's a desire for more, inordinate desire for more. And great example of this, you have 500 channels on cable TV, but I want 1,000 channels. I want more, right? I have a 39-inch high-def television. I want the 60-inch 4K, 8K, whatever version. It is an excessive desire for more, even though you already have, right? And you can see where that can be problematic. Again, you're misconstruing the many goods that God has given us and putting them as the good instead of relationship with God, which is actually the good. So that first question, what are the sins against the goods of others? We have to respect the goods of others and avoid the temptations of avarice, envy, and greed. Okay. The second question, what is restitution? Restitution is kind of the cure, if you will, the acting in justice that helps us to begin to soothe, ease the damage that we cause through our violations of the 7th and 10th commandments. Restitution is the making good on whatever property that we steal or damage from others. It's giving back what we owe, right, out of justice. So in many ways, Christ is pretty straightforward in giving us the antidote to covetousness, right? Whereas restitution is what happens when we fall prey to theft, like when we give in and fall into and give ourselves over to covetousness and the feelings of covetousness. We can have antidote before that, and right, Christ tells us about it. He gives it to us in the Beatitudes. He tells us blessed are the poor in spirit, right? For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So when we talk about spiritual poverty, right, the third of these, spiritual poverty is a good thing. It's a willing detachment from stuff, right? From the things of the world. It is a realization that God is the most important thing, most important part of being alive, relationship with Him, and saying, this other stuff is good, right? But the only thing that is going to fulfill me, the only thing that is going to give me everlasting happiness is that relationship with God. He's the only thing that can fulfill my heart. And so we have a tendency as human beings to be very kind of short-sighted, right? And to look at material things as absolute goods and ultimate ends. And that's not reality. The reality is that God is the ultimate end, and relationship with Him is the ultimate end. It's what we're created for. So it's that long-winded way of saying, what is spiritual poverty? It is the recognition that only God can satisfy our hearts, right? And this is a way for us to not need to go to restitution, because once we have that realization, all the other stuff, we see it for the good that it is, but not necessarily the good. And the good, of course, is relationship with God. So, one of the ways that we can help to develop spiritual poverty is by taking care of our possessions, because it makes them last longer, right? If we take care of them, we become stewards and not their absolute possessors, because if we take care of it, we can pass it on to somebody else. If we keep something instead of unnecessarily replacing it, we save money, which can then be sent on something worthwhile or even contributed through charity to other worthwhile organizations. So we sometimes, I think, always want the newest and best, but that is contrary necessarily to what we sometimes need, right? Sometimes what we need is to continue to have what we have and maintain it and build it up so that we can give in other ways to others, okay? So here we go. That's all I got for you today. I just want to give a gentle reminder to those of you that are watching the videos. Good. If you're not watching the videos, this next part is not going to help you, and you're probably one who can use this the most, but I'm not going to tell you in live classes this. It's only going to be on these videos. If you want to make corrections on your tests or quizzes starting not this coming week, but next week, starting Tuesday after Memorial Day, you can email me. You can ask me to reopen a test or quiz for you, and I will, and you can make corrections and improve your grade. Okay? That's all I got for you today. Be good, be well, love you, miss you, see you in class tomorrow. I'm going to be posting your lesson plans in just a couple minutes, hours, I don't know, but it'll be soonish after I post this. But that's all I got for you today. Love you, see you tomorrow. Bye.